Well, Shalom Aleichem. My name's Aaron Lansky, and I am the founder and president of the Yiddish Book Center. And it is really a pleasure to welcome all of you, not only those of you here in the audience, but also all of those, see those two cameras on the back wall there? We're streaming this as well, and we have people all over the world. So to everyone, I say hello today. And I should explain, this is our annual Melinda Rosenblatt Lecture. And it's a long-running series made possible through the vision and generosity of Leif and Johanna Rosenblatt in memory of Melinda Rosenblatt. So you're in for a wonderful lecture this afternoon. Our speaker, Professor Sam Kassow of Trinity College, is one of the great Jewish historians of our generation and also one of my closest friends. And in 2007, some of you may know, he published a magnum opus called Who Will Write Our History, about Emanuel Ringelbum, an earlier historian, who during the Second World War enlisted 60 writers and journalists to chronicle daily life under Nazi occupation in the Warsaw Ghetto. They compiled extraordinary accounts, and just before the ghetto was liquidated, they buried them in milk cans and tin boxes and buried them deep under the ghetto. Of the 60 members of Oyneg Shabbat, only 3 survived. And one of the 3 was a woman named Rachel Auerbach, who was a journalist and a psychologist, and she was running the local soup kitchen, the ghetto soup kitchen, but she was also, feeding thousands of people, but also writing down these stories. And after the war, she knew where the boxes were buried, and she tried to get her fellow Jews, the fellow survivors, to dig. It took, Sam, a year and a half or so before they actually dug. And as a result, she became one of the only survivors of the Holocaust who was able to write her own memoirs based on her own wartime writings that had been preserved. Eventually, she made her way to Israel. And until now, her heroic story has been very little known outside of rather narrow Yiddish-speaking precincts. She did write 3 versions of her memoirs, but until now, none had been translated into English. That's all changed as of today because of the work of the Yiddish Book Center through our own imprint called White Goat Press. And we are just now publishing Professor Kassow's really quite wonderful translation. It's a compilation and a conflation and translation of these memoirs, and it's being published under the title of Warsaw Testament. So written by Auerbach, translated by Sam, and it's really a tour de force. If you read just one book this year, this is the book I would recommend, and I say that with all fervor and belief and conviction, because it's really, that's how wonderful it really is. I just want to say that hundreds of people have contributed to our ongoing translation efforts here at the center. We've published 20 books in the past year alone. But I want to make special mention of the supporters for this particular volume, and that's Muriel and Larry Gillick, and also Rosa Rosenberg. Also, the organizer of White Goat Press, the publisher of White Goat Press, is Lisa Newman, along with Jeff Hayes. And also, I want to thank for editorial support from our own Ezra Glinta. Ezra, thank you so much for working on this project. So without further ado, it's my honor to present my friend, a national treasure of the Jewish people, and I guess you could say, in some ways, the last great hero of Oyneg Shabbat, Sam Kassow.
Well, thank you, Aaron, for those very kind words. And I also want to thank Lisa Newman and Jeff Hayes and Ezra Glinter for all the help they gave me in seeing this book through. It was not easy. I also want to thank my wonderful wife, Lisa, for giving me moral support. And I'm also truly grateful to have the opportunity to give this year's Melinda Rosenblatt Lecture. And I'd like to thank Leif Rosenblatt for all he does for the Jewish community, as well as for the National Yiddish Book Center. And I still remember that day, maybe it was about 35 years ago, when I was rummaging through the old book center warehouse in that Holyoke factory building on the 5th floor, and I found 2 books by Rachel Auerbach. And at that time, I knew very little about her, but I guess it all started that afternoon. And indeed, until relatively recently, few people have heard of Rachel Auerbach. She was a remarkable woman who'd survived the Holocaust and then dedicated her whole life to preserving the memory of the victims. And her life spanned many markers of the 20th century Jewish experience. Galicia, the Yiddish literary scene of pre-war Warsaw, the Ringelblum archive in the Warsaw Ghetto. She left the Warsaw Ghetto in March 1943, got a fake Polish ID, posed as a Polish woman, and crisscrossed occupied Warsaw for almost 2 years as an intrepid, courageous courier for the Jewish underground. In post-war Poland, she joined the Central Jewish Historical Commission and did pioneering historical research, the first person to write about Treblinka. After she left Poland for Israel in 1950, she started the Survivor Testimony Division at Yad Vashem and played a very important behind-the-scenes role during the Eichmann trial when she urged Gideon Hauser, the chief prosecutor, to put survivor testimony front and center, rather than just focus on Eichmann's specific activities in the Nazi bureaucracy. The trial, Auerbach believed, should educate Israelis and others about what it really meant to be a Jew under Nazi occupation. In the last years of her life, she reworked her wartime writings into memoirs of the Warsaw Ghetto. And she managed to finish 1 volume. She died in 1976 as she was writing the second. So it's those volumes, the whole first and much of the second, that I translated for the Book Center under the title Warsaw Testament. Among those wartime writings was a remarkable essay entitled Yizkor, Remember. She wrote it in November 1943. The ghetto was just a heap of rubble. The Jews were all gone. And on a dreary day in that November, she was riding in a streetcar in Aryan, Warsaw. And by now, public German executions of Polish hostages on the Warsaw streets were becoming a daily occurrence. And suddenly, a Polish woman sitting in that streetcar started to weep. The Germans had just shot her son, my son, she cried over and over. And Auerbach thought to herself, this woman can weep openly. I can't. I may neither groan nor weep. I may not draw attention to myself in the street, and I need to groan, I need to weep, not 4 times a year when you say Yizkor. I feel the need to say Yizkor 4 times a day. So that very day, that night, she went back to her room on Smolna Street. Her landlady had no idea she was harboring a Jew and began to write that essay that she entitled Yizkor. How do you say Yizkor for 500,000 Jews? And as she groped for images to explain the sheer magnitude of the catastrophe, as she struggled to kind of overcome the gap between words and the reality, she began with the example of a flood. And she started, I saw a flood once in the mountains. Wooden huts, torn from their foundations, were carried above the raging waters. One can see lighted lamps in them, men, women, children in cradles tied to ceiling beams. Other huts were empty, but one could see a tangle of arms waving from the roof like branches blowing in the wind. waving desperately toward heaven, waving towards the riverbanks for help. At a distance, one could see mouths gaping, but one could not hear the cries because the roar of the waters drowned out everything. And that's how the Jewish masses flowed to their destruction at the time of the deportations, sinking as helplessly into the abyss. Why did she begin this essay with the image of a natural disaster, the image of a flood? I think that as she wrote, she could already guess what people who weren't there were going to, the questions they were going to ask after the war. What had happened to those millions of Polish Jews? Why had they let themselves be fooled? Those tough, bright, resourceful Jews, why didn't they resist? So, because she in using the imagery of a flood, of a natural disaster, as David Roskies once pointed out, Auerbach anticipated these questions. How can you criticize the reactions of people swept away in a flood or a tsunami? How do you nitpick their reactions? No, the Holocaust was not a meta-historical event and had to be studied in detail, but its enormity was too horrible and too unprecedented to allow for glib theories and facile questions that might compromise the memory of the Jewish masses that she cherished so deeply. In the same essay she added, and if for even one of the days of my life I should forget how I saw you then, my people, desperate and confused, delivered over to extinction, may all knowledge of me be forgotten, may my name be cursed like that of those traitors who are unworthy to share your pain. And Auerbach never broke that vow. And for the rest of her life, she lived only to make sure that people remembered. Nobody told the story of the Warsaw Ghetto with as much passion and insight. Few worked more diligently to persuade historians, lawyers, and the wider public to listen, really listen to the testimony of survivors and remember not just the famous names, but the ordinary people who went to their deaths. At a time when the Warsaw Ghetto uprising emerged as the symbol of Jewish resistance and heroism during the Holocaust, it was Auerbach who pleaded with the wider public to remember the writers and the poets, along with the fighters, to respect the importance of cultural and spiritual resistance alongside armed resistance, to ponder not just the trauma of mass murder, but also the deep wound of cultural genocide. The Germans committed a double murder, the physical destruction of the Jews, but also the erasure of their Yiddish speech and cultural legacy. What Annette Viavorka called the era of the witness came about in no small measure thanks to the unstinting efforts of people like Rachel Auerbach to highlight the importance of survivor testimony, the Eichmann trial being a key example. At a time when pioneering scholars like Raoul Hilberg argued that documents are better sources than survivor accounts, Auerbach said, yes, documents are well and good, but perpetrators are the ones who leave the documents. And long before the work of Saul Friedlander and Jan Thomas Gross, Auerbach insisted that the voice of the victims be heard and weighed, that scholars and jurists take survivor testimony seriously, focusing not just on content, but on the nuances of body language, phrasing, and affect. And so what if the survivor might get a few dates and names wrong? The authority of witness far outweighed mistakes in the details. As only one of the 3 survivors of the Oyneg Shabes Archive of the 60 that Ringelblum brought in, Auerbach had the rare opportunity not just to retrieve her wartime writings that had been buried, but to rewrite and publish them. But on July 26, 1942, the 4th day of the mass deportations to Treblinka, Ringelblum had ordered all members of the archive to hand over their writings without delay, which they would be buried in the first cache of the archive that was discovered in September 1946. There was no time to lose. The Germans, with the help of the Jewish police, were deporting 7,000 Jews a day. The deportations began on Wednesday. This was already Saturday. And as she handed over her voluminous ghetto writings to Ringelblum's assistant, Eliyahu Gutkovsky, Auerbach added a note that revealed her feelings of raw fear, violent anger, and despair. And I'm quoting, "I'm handing over this unfinished essay to the archive. The fifth day of the Aktion, the fifth day of the deportation. Perhaps such horrors have already occurred before in Jewish history, but such shame, never. Jews as tools of the killers. I want to stay alive. I'm ready to kiss the boots of the worst scoundrel, dem gemeinsten Cham, just to be able to see the moment of revenge. Revenge, revenge, revenge. Nekome, nekome, nekome." And by the way, one of the clear differences between wartime, real-time writing and survivor testimony after the war is that there's a lot of anger against other Jews in wartime writing that kind of gets filtered out after the war when all the 6 million were Kedoshim, were just martyrs. But you see that anger here. In that same note that she wrote that day, Auerbach also wondered whether her writings would share the same fate as the scribblings of a coal miner trapped in an accident with no survivors, whose body would never be found. Would anyone read what she was writing? Would anyone care? And besides, she could no longer write coherently. And if she survived, what good would she be to anybody? So fast forward 2 years to early 1944. She's on the Aryan side with false papers. Now she no longer has any doubt she has to write. That's a debt she owes to the dead. But she also tells herself that she has to be careful. And I quote, "The mass murder, the murder of millions of Jews by the Germans, is a fact that speaks for itself. It's very dangerous to add to this subject interpretations or analyses. Anything that is said can quickly turn into hopeless hysteria or endless sobs. So one must approach this subject with the greatest caution in a restrained and factual manner. This has been my intention, not to express, but to transmit, to note only facts, but not to interpret." But she quickly added that she realized immediately that such a mandate was impossible even for herself. After the war, in Poland and in Israel, after she had recovered her wartime manuscripts, her writing would take on yet another purpose, to ensure that the Jewish people remembered, not only to keep faith with the dead, but also to use the lessons of the Holocaust to strengthen the state of Israel, to strengthen the Jewish people, and to tighten the bonds between Israel and the diaspora. Auerbach left Poland for Israel in 1950, and while she had many difficulties in her new home, she never wavered in her conviction that after the Holocaust, Israel had become the vital center of the Jewish people. And for those who read Yiddish, I highly recommend her book, In Land Yisrael, a book of reportage of the early 50s that revealed her devotion to the new state, as well as her empathy for the struggles of the new immigrants, Jews from the Middle East and North Africa, no less than survivors of the Holocaust. Although her comparisons of certain Yemenite Jews to rural Galician Jews and villages might be a bit of a stretch. But let me add, For those who erroneously see some imagined contradiction between love of Yiddish and Zionism, let them think about Rachel Auerbach, about Avram Sutzkever, about Leib Rohkl, and about many others. Like all good reportage, Auerbach's post-war books conveyed what she saw and observed in evocative, powerful language that made her writings an indispensable source for the cultural and social history of the Warsaw Ghetto. The first step was to describe just what the Jewish people lost when the Germans destroyed Jewish Warsaw. Just after the war, Auerbach's friend Leo Finkelstein wrote, Warsaw's strength derived not from zchus ovis, but from zchus otzma, not from its historical tradition, like Vilna, but from its sheer mass and power. Warsaw had no encrusted traditions. It was a new city for Jews, and thus it could serve as a pathbreaker in the modernization of Jewish life. When Finkelstein thought of Warsaw, what he emphasized were the crowds, the masses of Jews who came to Peretz's funeral, to the Bund's May Day demonstrations, the tens of thousands of Hasidim that would come to the railroad station to greet the Ger Rebbe. Another literary critic, Shlomo Bellis, wrote a post-war essay comparing the Vilna and the Warsaw ghettos. And he has an interesting quote, and I quote, "Is it not symbolic? Warsaw provided the battle, Vilna provided the song. Sag nicht keinmal, als du gehst den letzten Weg, the partisan song. At the crucial moment, the Vilna Jews did not support an armed uprising. The Warsaw Jews did." And then Bellis goes on to say, is that not a reflection of the entire history of these two Jewish centers? Vilna earned its place because of its quality. Warsaw earned its place in East European Jewish history because of its quantity as well as its quality, because of its enormous Jewish population. She took first place in the Jewish world. Avram Lewin, a key member of the Oyneg Shabes, wrote in November 1942, shortly before he was murdered in Treblinka, that Warsaw had been the nerve center of Polish Jewry, and Polish Jewry had been the cultural center of Ashkenazi Jewry. How then could the Jewish people survive this disaster? That Lewin, who soon would be dead, could ask this question only underscores the special agony felt by Holocaust victims, most of whom were killed in 1942 when the Germans were actually winning the war. And before they died, they had to witness the destruction of their families, their people, their Yiddish speech without any trace of consolation, without the knowledge, for instance, that a Jewish state would arise after the war. Imagine Levin's despair or Yitzhak Katznelson's despair. And if Auerbach could do nothing else, she could at least ensure that posterity remember what this great Jewish metropolis meant. Her first visit to Jewish Warsaw happened in 1925 in Chol HaMoed Pesach, the intermediate days of Passover. They were dedicating the Peretz, the Ohel Peretz's grave at the Warsaw Cemetery, and tens of thousands of Jews were streaming through the streets. And I quote, this is Anita Norwich's translation, but that was the first time I'd seen such a thing. I was astonished, deeply moved, organized and spontaneous delegations swept through masses of Jews of all walks of life, wearing caps and hats and yarmulkes, businessmen and workers, young and old, a mobile forest of people. To my eyes, it looked like something out of Asia. I could never have seen such a thing among Jews in Lemberg, where she lived at the time. This was Jewish Warsaw, and this is how it expressed its feelings for one of its spiritual leaders. She wrote those lines 20 years later in 1945 as Warsaw lay in ruins. Now, she added, there were fewer Jews in all of Poland than she saw that day who came to the cemetery to honor parents. Melech Ravitch, the Yiddish poet, who'd been one of Auerbach's key mentors and closest friends, had once called Warsaw a sprawling mosaic of different Jewish tribes and subcultures, Hasidim, Polish-speaking professionals, Litvaks. Auerbach took the shattered bits and shards and reconstructed a mosaic of memory based on the poignant evocation of dozens of individual vignettes. And thus she spoke for those who had no one to remember them. The ordinary Jews she came to know in the ghetto as she ran the soup kitchen on Leshno 40, the Jewish writers, artists, and actors whose milieu she shared in the 1930s. The more one knew about what and whom the Germans had murdered, the more one could grasp the enormity of the national churban, of the national disaster. So much of Warsaw Testament includes Auerbach's wartime and post-war descriptions of the Warsaw Jewish intelligentsia. Writers like Kalman Lis, who before the war had worked with children with special needs. Actresses like Miriam Arleska, who'd played Leah in the landmark Vilna Trupa production of The Dybbuk. Painters and sculptors like Avram Mosjega, who designed Peretz's tomb. Composers and choir directors such as David Eisenstadt, singers such as his 17-year-old daughter Marisha Eisenstadt, whom Jews had called the Nightingale of the Ghetto, whose concerts were unforgettable. Marisha was gunned down in cold blood as Jews were boarding the death trains to Treblinka. Auerbach described Shia Breudet, her boss in the Alleinhill, who had been translating Plato's dialogues into Yiddish. Yankov Gerstein, who was composing a cantata based on the poetry of Mani Leib. The religious poet Yisrael Stern, who wrote his best poetry, Auerbach believed, just months before his death. Rosa Simchovich, a saintly pedagogue who dedicated her life to helping the poor kids who went to the Yiddish secular schools. Lev Shur, who collected abandoned Yiddish books in the ghetto and who hanged himself in his library. Basha Berman, who started a children's library where kids could come in, borrow books, and listen to stories of faraway places that promised a better world after the war. There was the 11-year-old Yosima, a musical prodigy who played Mozart's 25th piano concerto in the ghetto, after which the musicians in the orchestra lifted her up as the audience applauded, and someone then presented her with a chocolate bar. If only this play had survived, that cantata, that poem, what she heard in the ghetto represented, as she said, a flowering of Jewish genius, a bright flame just before the final destruction. As Auerbach traced the broad reach of Yiddish culture, which embraced music and the arts as well as literature, she underscored the depth. She underscored the sheer enormity of a German murder machine that destroyed a language and a culture along with the people. Before the war, Auerbach, like many Yiddish writers, had been pessimistic about Warsaw's future as a Yiddish cultural center. How could Yiddish survive, writers asked, much less thrive, when more and more Jewish kids were going to Polish schools, and when Polish Jews, faced with boycotts and discrimination, were waging a desperate battle just to put bread on the table and had little money to spend on Yiddish books and Yiddish theater. But after the war, she changed her mind. She explained that before the war, she doubted the prospects for Yiddish culture in Poland because she'd underestimated the vitality of the Polish Yiddish masses. It was her work in the self-help of the ghetto, in the Alleinhill, as it was called, in the soup kitchens, that she came into close contact not only with ordinary Jews, but also with the impressive leaders of the Orthodox religious world that she never would have met had it not been for the war. It was then that she understood, and only then, that Jewish life in the Polish provinces was so deeply rooted that the Jewish people could have counted on the cultural capital of Polish Jewry for generations to come. And I quote, "Despite everything, we were surrounded with enormously powerful and dynamic Jewish folk masses. Those masses were too numerous and too rooted in their culture for acculturation and assimilation to proceed. The religious strata constituted an enormous reservoir of human resources and spiritual energy, and they were able to make up any losses we suffered due to acculturation and then some. We thought," she's writing, "that we came to Jewish Warsaw too late." She's talking about the 1930s, "after the best was already over. In fact, the blooms had faded only to prepare for the next harvest of fruit, had it not been for the terrible catastrophe that befell us." As soon as the war ended, Auerbach resolved to carry out Ringelblum's legacy, find those tin boxes and milk cans buried in the trackless rubble of what had been the Warsaw Ghetto. The Yiddish writer Mendel Mann recalled Auerbach's talk at a third anniversary commemoration of the Ghetto Uprising. It happened in 1946. A lot of tiresome speeches, a lot of political posturing. Then Auerbach, the only woman on the podium, got up to speak. And I'm quoting Mendel Mann. "She did not make any speeches. She did not explain the meaning of the uprising. She implored. With a stubbornness that deeply affected me, she demanded, she called, 'Remember, there's a national treasure under the ruins. Even if there are 5 stories of rubble, we have to find the archive. I'm not making this up. I know what I'm talking about. This isn't just talk. This is coming from my heart. I will not rest and I will not let you rest. We must rescue the Ringelblum archive.'" Mendel Mann also remembered that Auerbach met with a cool reception. People had their own troubles. They didn't need an archive to tell them what they'd gone through. But Auerbach disagreed. More than ever, survivors had to organize a systematic and collective effort to record the past and to continue the work of the Oyneg Shabbat. The tradition, she believed, of the Ringelblum archive would counteract disturbing trends that she'd already noticed in the first memoirs that were coming out after the war. Assimilated Jews who'd survived, like the biologist Ludwig Hirschfeld, who'd converted to Christianity, or the pianist Władysław Szpilman, about whom the movie The Pianist was made, had already written memoirs, she believed, that gave a skewed picture of the Jewish masses in the ghetto. But she was also outraged how quickly other survivors rushed to score political points or claim credit for this or that political party. And Auerbach held up the model of the Oyneg Shabbat, where she believed a shared sense of national mission had trumped political differences. Ringelblum had brought together religious and secular Jews, Bundists, Zionists and communists, the famous and the not so famous, men and women, in a common mission to collect and bury documents. Ringelblum's teacher, Isaac Schippert, said to a fellow inmate in Majdanek, quote, what we know about murdered peoples is usually what their killers choose to say about them. And the Germans thought, of course, that they would win the war and they would determine how the Jews would be remembered, if at all. But in an amazing act of spiritual resistance, Ringelblum said, no, posterity will remember us on the basis of Jewish and not German documents. That's the title I chose for my book, Who Will Write Our History? These time capsules will surface someday, even if we don't live to see it ourselves, and the murdered Polish Jews will be remembered not as a faceless mask of anonymous victims, but as individuals with names, with identities, individuals who are part of a resilient Jewish community with hopes, dreams, and agency. But Ringelblum also called on his fellow members of the archive not to pull punches, to be objective, to write about the dark spots as well as the good sides, to write about the collaborators as well as the heroes. And Auerbach took that message to heart after the war. In the aftermath of the catastrophe, she believed that the wounded, traumatized Jewish people had to look at its record and take lessons from what happened in the Holocaust. And that meant to tell the whole truth, to add and subtract nothing. This was a debt, not just to the victims who died, but to a Jewish nation, and especially to an Israel that had to build a new reality. She hallowed the exploits of the ghetto fighters and the partisans, but she did not want their story to overshadow and diminish the memory of the 99% who had no weapons, of the ordinary Jews who did what they could to maintain their dignity, help their families, and who, lacking money or contacts on the Aryan side, and even the ability to imagine the worst, were swept away in the torrent of death. Like much of the Oyneg Shabes staff, Auerbach was active in the pre-war YIVO, where scholars and ordinary Jews worked together to zammel, to collect documents and source materials and build archives. And a key goal of the YIVO was to explore everyday Jewish life. In Max Weinreich's words, zu erkennen dem Heint, to understand today. To study that through surveys, interviews, the writing of personal documents such as autobiographies. This was the modus operandi of the Oyneg Shabes, which in many ways was basically the YIVO continuing in the Warsaw Ghetto. Indeed, the very structure of Auerbach's wartime writings stressed the close links of the Jewish intelligentsia and the Jewish masses, just as the YIVO did. The first title of her essays on the murdered writers, musicians, and artists was entitled Zusammen mit dem Volk, Together with the People. And she followed in the footsteps, not just of Emanuel Ringelbum, but of YIVO director Max Weinreich, who made special efforts to incorporate the insights of Sigmund Freud and social psychology into the study of Polish Jewry. In the highly politicized and divided world of interwar Polish Jewry, where so many stress the primacy of the collective, the party, the movement, the ideology over the individual, Max Weinreich, in his youth studies project, Jugendforschung, for instance, argued that one could not understand the Jewish collective, Klal Yisrael, unless you grasp the needs of the Jewish individual, Reb Yisrael, the aspirations, the drives, the obsessions, the hopes of the many individuals who made up that 4 million strong Jewish mass in Poland, especially young people. Auerbach, whose main field of university study had been psychology, and who'd written extensively on psychology in the pre-war Jewish press, needed little convincing. And so in her Holocaust writing, she highlighted the complex interplay of psychological factors, individuals, families, entire social groups. She told a complicated story. On the one hand, resilience, vitality, self-sacrifice. On the other hand, corruption and moral collapse. She had brilliant insights, the result of conversations with the folklorist Shmuel Lehman in the ghetto about how rumors, jokes, street songs could be seen as a self-defense reflex, a poignant but powerful sign of instinctive resistance. Auerbach described the Germans' skillful use of psychological weapons to effect the destruction of Warsaw Jewry and to use the Jews' strengths against them. The Germans played with the Jews and with their natural human instincts of self-preservation and hope. In her brilliant observations of the mass hysteria that gripped the Warsaw Ghetto in the summer of 1942, Auerbach described how the very qualities that had served Jews so well in the past, practicality, pragmatism, hard-headedness, seichel, common sense, and natural optimism now accelerated their journey into the abyss. The natural optimism. We Jews have suffered before. We'll get through this. Wir werden sie überleben. We will outlive them. Seichel. Look, let's buy time. We'll bribe the Germans. We'll give them gifts. We'll work hard for the Wehrmacht. Why would they want to kill us if we're so useful? Auerbach delved into the riddle of how the Jews let themselves be fooled, how they failed to grasp the Nazi plan. Here's an excerpt of what she wrote then. And still other Jews, broad-shouldered, deep-voiced, with powerful hands and hearts. Artisans, workers, wagon drivers, porters, Jews who with a blow of their fists could floor any hooligan who dared enter their neighborhoods. Where were you when your wives and children, when your old fathers and mothers were taken away? What happened to make you run off like cattle stampeded by fire? Was there no one to give you some purpose in the confusion? You were swept away by the flood, together with those who were weak. Would other peoples confronted with a similar massive assault have acted better? She did not think so. Did Warsaw Jewry eventually recover from the shock and fight back? Yes, obviously. Should one blame the Jewish masses for not having fought back earlier? Only those who had not been there, Auerbach implied, would do so. Was armed resistance the only way the Jews could have stood up to the Germans? Absolutely not. Like her collaborator in the Oyneg Shabes, Peretz Opaczynski, Rachel Auerbach was a superb observer of the Jewish everyday. She had a fine sense of the nuances of the behavior and speech of different classes of Polish Jews, whether they lived in small towns or in urban centers like Warsaw. Like Ringelblum, she was a native of Southeast Galicia. Before moving with her family to Lemberg, she'd spent her childhood in a remote village, not a shtetl, in Podolia, Lanowitz, where she acquired a love of Jewish folklore and the Yiddish language. And she also lived cheek by jowl with the Poles and Ukrainians. Like many other Galician Jews, Auerbach combined this deep Jewish identity with a first-class Polish education and cultural sensibility. And she wrote much of her essays, many of her essays in Polish. At Lvov University in the early 1920s, Auerbach befriended the young poetess Dvora Fogel and the budding writer and painter Bruno Schulz. And she urged Schulz to start writing in Yiddish. Schulz didn't do so, but Fogel did. In 1929, she began a literary journal in Lvov in Yiddish to try to persuade the mostly Polish-speaking Jewish intelligentsia in Galicia to have more respect for Yiddish culture. But that didn't really work. But from a very young age, her vision of Yiddish culture, unlike many, was inclusive rather than exclusive. It was a vision of Yiddish culture that united Jews rather than divided them, that transcended political differences, a culture whose creativity would shame those who saw Yiddish as nothing more than a low-class jargon. In the late 1930s, she moved to Warsaw. She entered a relationship, a dysfunctional relationship with the Yiddish poet Itzik Manger. All through her life, she suffered a lot from misogyny, a lot of wisecracks about her being a woman. In the 30s, her nickname in Warsaw literary circles was die literarische Beilage, the literary supplement, because she was Manger's girlfriend and she was not taken seriously. There's no question that her later rocky path at Yad Vashem would have been easier had she not been a woman. But that only encouraged Auerbach to redouble her efforts to highlight the critical contributions of women to Yiddish literature. Much of the power of Auerbach's reportage stemmed from her ability to navigate cultural boundaries. And that was derived from the fact that she lived a life that straddled different worlds: village, shtetl, and city, Yiddish and Polish, Poles and Jews, Galicia and Warsaw, the milieu of the Jewish literary elite and the world of the Jewish masses, religious and secular, diaspora nationalists and Zionists. At the end of September 1939, after Poland surrendered, Auerbach was about to flee the shattered city of Warsaw for Lvov, where she had family. And just as she was about to run, she received an unexpected summons from Emanuel Ringelbum, who said, "Stay, I need you to run a soup kitchen." Much of the Jewish elite had already run away, but Ringelblum reminded Auerbach, and I quote, "Not everybody has the right to run." And thus, Ringelblum brought Auerbach into the far-flung network of the Alleinhilfe for the Jewish self-help in the ghetto, which had hundreds of house committees, soup kitchens, daycare centers. The leaders of the Alleinhilfe saw the organization as the conscience of Warsaw Jewry, as a counterweight to the Judenrat. During World War I, Yitzhak Leibush Peretz, the great Yiddish writer, had stressed the interdependence of relief on the one hand and Sammling and the writing of history on the other. And in the Second World War, by the same token, the Alleinhilfe made the functioning of the Oyneg Shabes Archive possible. Ringelblum used the soup kitchens and the refugee centers to gather information and find writers, as well as try to save the cadres of the Jewish intelligentsia by giving them jobs. In 1941, he recruited Auerbach to the archive itself and asked her to write an essay about the soup kitchen. As Auerbach would note after the war, had it not been for Ringelblum, she would not have written anything. That soup kitchen that Auerbach ran on Leshno 40 fed 2,000 Jews a day, and it offered a unique vantage point to get to know and observe what ordinary Jews went through. It provided, the story she told, provided a gripping behind-the-scenes look at the desperate battle that the ghetto was fighting against hunger. She investigated the social history of hunger by seeing the soup kitchen as a microcosm of human relationships and human choices. The dead who ended up in the mass graves of the Gensha cemetery were not an undifferentiated mass, but individuals whose idiosyncrasies Auerbach recorded and who you could read about in Warsaw Testament. She deftly caught the phrases and habits that made them memorable. The young mother expelled from her shtetl, who arrived at the soup kitchen with 4 children in tow, and a tot who was suckling at her breast. A family of solid, rugged Jewish boys from a country farm who had also been expelled into the ghetto. And each day they take a bowl of soup for their aged father. And when they mentioned him, they never failed to add, Im zu 120, may he live to be 120. Solid members of the Jewish middle class now reduced to desperate poverty. Auerbach, as the director of the soup kitchen, confronted serious psychological pressures and moral challenges. Like other members of the Alleinhilfe, she'd seen herself as an honest public servant imbued with the moral code of the progressive Jewish intelligentsia. But she discovered very quickly that for the masses of starving, desperate people who came to the kitchen each day, she represented authority and power. In their eyes, she'd become an arbiter of life and death. Like Ringelblum, she'd come from a milieu that was imbued with love of the Jewish masses. Now these masses, these ordinary Jews, stormed her office, blocked her in the corridors, and begged for extra soup tickets. They looked at Auerbach as someone who could save them. Some confronted her in silent supplication. Others yelled and loudly reminded Auerbach of their former status. Yes, I was a doctor once. How could you let me starve? Then there were the children who would come in packs and rummage around the scraps and cajole her in Yiddish accented Polish. Please, ma'am, a little extra food. And it really seemed to her that in the end, the kitchen only prolonged the agony but saved nobody. Should she favor a chosen few and give them extra food, or dole out rations equally and save nobody? Ringelblum asked the same question. Increasingly frustrated, Auerbach actually singled out a chosen few for special care. The poet Israel Stern, or a German-speaking refugee from the Sudetenland who had survived Dachau and who Ringelblum wanted to keep alive as a witness. This former athlete, the Dutch, as he was called in Warsaw Yiddish, won Auerbach over with his impeccable manners, good nature, and spry sense of humor. For Auerbach, this Brockmeister became a litmus test and a challenge. She bent her rules. She gave him extra food. When he began to become apathetic and swell up, a common sign of starvation, she would yell at him that she could feed him, but that he had to summon up the will to live. It was important, Auerbach felt, to win at least one victory, to save one person. But here too she failed. In her diary entry of August 4th, 1941, she noted, "What's the use of all this work if we can't save even one person from death by hunger?" As I said, on the Aryan side, Auerbach became a courier for the Jewish underground, and she continued to write for the secret archive of the Jewish National Committee, Archiv Hemshech. With the help of Polish friends, Auerbach buried her writings in two different locations in Warsaw, on the grounds of the Warsaw Zoo and in a field in the southern district of Mokotów. Both caches survived the war. As Auerbach wrote, "I had better luck in saving paper than in saving people." One of the most striking features of her wartime writings is her portrayal of Poland and the Polish people. As a courier who distributed money and aid to hidden Jews, Auerbach was in constant contact with a category, very small in number, of Poles who most Jews in the war never had a chance to meet, the liberal intellectual elite. Her descriptions of such individuals as Jan Żabiński, who's described in The Zookeeper's Wife, and his wife are particularly instructive and insightful. Żabiński had been the director of the Warsaw Zoo, as well as an officer in the Polish underground. And during the war, he and his wife had helped many Jews, including Auerbach herself. Auerbach's years in Israel at Yad Vashem are the subject of another talk, although I'd happily answer questions in the Q&A. But I'd like to end by saying how apt it is that we honor Auerbach's memory on Yom HaShoah, and that we do so at the National Yiddish Book Center, which has done so much to preserve the Yiddish culture to which she dedicated her life. Thank you.